The Discourse starts right now with Cheryl Oates and Erica Barudis.
And we're back with another episode of The Discourse. This week, we're doing a deep dive into party politics, talking about the inner workings of our respected parties, what we think they do well, and what gives us the ick.
And if you are a passive follower of politics, you may think it's all the same. And I've heard it before, I'm just going to vote for the lesser of two evils, or I'm going to vote for the devil I know. But under the surface, what drives progressive campaigns versus conservative campaigns looks really different. And just to kick us off, I would start with the fact that the NDP, at least in my experience, is quite dedicated to telling the truth and playing by the rules. And the same cannot be said for all political parties.
That's very interesting that you decided to take us there to start off. I do remember a little midfield mobile chat during your leadership discussion where one of your candidates was actually caught by the other for straight up lying. So I'm not sure if I think facts and figures and truth telling is maybe your golden goose there, Cheryl.
I don't think that's a good example. Like talking about the broad spectrum.
What about
here.
Nenshi lying about his ins right now? Like the crap he's saying going into the house, and he's like this and that, and the world is burning down, and
okay, but
yada.
What's he lying about?
He lies about
just 'cause you
numbers
don't like
and
it.
stats. No, it's that nobody's printing it because it's crazy stuff that he's talking about the government doing. They come out with fear mongering, which isn't fact based either. And that is the role of opposition. And I think it's easier to also say that the truth and the facts are led by the opposition because nobody really fact checks you and nobody's really paying attention to you in the same way that you are the government.
That is such a ridiculous flip. Like the government of all people.
Your comment at the beginning was ridiculous. So just matching your tone you're coming in with today.
The government above all is expected with a giant bureaucracy behind it to be able to tell the truth and have facts and figures to back it up at all times. Mm-hmm. Just as a starting place, the opposition doesn't have access to those resources. So saying that that's an equal playing field, first of all, is a wrong place to start from. But when we talk about campaigns, I'm talking about the willingness of a campaign, so the willingness of the UCP versus the willingness of the NDP to stretch the truth or flat out lie. And I would say that when it comes to campaigning, conservatives are a lot more willing to flat out lie.
Okay, then I'm going to ask you for an example.
So I can think of an example. I just came off the Saskatchewan campaign, which is not the UCP, but is similar. Just came off the Saskatchewan campaign where they ran ads every day saying the NDP supports the carbon tax. Carla Beck had said every single day, I do not support the carbon tax. I have never supported the carbon tax. But it's in their political interest to say she does support the carbon tax. So despite all the facts that she had said she doesn't, they continued to push lies.
But you did have candidates that did.
But as a party, we didn't support the carbon tax. Saying that we did is a lie.
But not unanimously. So if you find
but Erica,
people, we both played the opposition game. You guys came out and were like, this person doesn't believe in climate change, blah, 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 because they said something stupid once. We do it too. We're both been in war rooms. So I don't think it's a flat out lie, though. You guys do it too. If you're going to say that we're guilty of that and they don't, did she stand up and say, we do not believe in the carbon tax? And
yes.
Every one of my candidates would?
No one ever says every one of my candidates because it doesn't matter. The party is going to do what the party is going to do, even if one or two candidates disagree.
So you have radical candidates and you think that escapes them from being it? Because you guys had a few crazy candidates in our last election in May. And so I think it's interesting because even in your leadership, you guys couldn't. Yeah, well, I'm not saying we didn't, but we both play the opposition game, right? You find those nuggets and you leverage them. And I think that's maybe something, and I know we want to talk about how conservatives campaign or how conservatives are getting the message out maybe a little bit stronger than the progressives. But I do think I'll give you, we maybe stretch or tell the story in the narrative that benefits us, but right back at you, girlfriend.
No, I do. I mean, I think this is both a lovely ethical piece of the NDP that we are so dedicated to telling the truth. I think that's great. But it also, when your opponents do not play by the rules, when your opponents don't play by the rules and your opponents don't tell the truth, it's not an equal playing field. And so it puts the NDP at a detriment because we're going to scrutinize everything we say and every piece of policy we put forward, and our opponents just aren't doing it.
And so you're saying you're holier than thou, but because we're such shitty humans,
Yes,
you lower
exactly.
yourselves and get
Exactly.
into the mud, making you not also awesome human beings if you're willing. Stay
No,
high then. Why can't you stay high?
this isn't about, like, truthfully, this isn't about bad human beings. And not in every case am I saying you're a bad human being for having stretched the truth. I'm saying they're just different ways of campaigning. Like, yeah, if you're going to tell a flat out lie to voters, I think that's a little duplicitous. I think a lot of what Danielle Smith has done, her campaign versus how she's governed, is quite duplicitous. But in every case, does it make you a bad human being? That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the NDP is quite dedicated to this. And as we've gone through time, the Conservatives have stretched the truth a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And perhaps, you look to the States to see what we could become if we just decide to throw it all out the window.
Now you're just like throwing us down to being all Trump supporters or what?
No, not Trump supporters, but like that's what it looks like when the truth doesn't matter anymore.
Well, you know what? I actually do see a bridge in maybe some of the ways that we communicate, which has been working, which was successful for Donald Trump. And I'm not saying that, as I've said before, a conservative up here doesn't necessarily align with Republicans in the States. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but it's like not it's apples to oranges. But I do think when we talk about like who's communicating strong, and let's put the facts and figures aside, because I think we're just never going to agree. But one thing I think we do agree on is actually how the conservatives are communicating, or the right is communicating with voters, is actually very strategic, and it's working across our country. And we just saw it work to the South, where they have a different tone, more approachable, talking directly to an individual, versus I think maybe the left that's doing a little bit too high level communication. Or I don't know what your take is on the left strategy right now.
No, I mean, in this, I completely agree. I think conservatives are just campaigning in a much more effective way than many progressive parties are right now. And we've seen it in the US in the last election, and we see it in jurisdictions across Canada. We see it federally right now, is conservatives have found a way to talk to voters in the way that they talk to each other. And in many cases, progressive parties are speaking more academically and more high level. And it's like with a lot of big words and policy detail. And that's just not the way that people talk to each other around their tables, out for coffee, out for a drink. And party allegiances aside, the conservatives have found a way to talk like regular people, which, as you can imagine, is much more appealing to regular people.
Yeah, and I think that goes outside of just average, like, during a campaign and when you're getting the most bang for your buck on every message you say. I think that they've found a way. I mean, we've seen these walk and talk videos of Pierre Poilievre really become quite dominant, and it's a one-way communication. It's strategic because you can't have the criticisms come back at you. You just get to have your message, but it looks like you're having a to B conversation. And I think, you know what, even during my time in politics, I've shifted of like, quote unquote, what I want in a party leader. And I went from like stalwart, never want to have a beer with you. You're very statesman-like, big words, big policies. And I think, I don't know if it's as I've got older or been around this longer, but I like the communicating politics and like truly just dropping it down to what's in it for me. I don't care about $2 billion. I want to know what that $2 billion means for my household. And I think the conservatives have done a really good job of pivoting that to, which is very traditional of conservative ideology, is like to the individual.
Yeah, and it is sort of like this trend, at least that I've seen, is like people are looking for more authenticity from their political leaders and from the parties that they're considering voting for. And that comes with the way that they talk, the way that they present themselves, the words that they use, the emotions that they use, but also in terms of the production value. So like when you look at the conservatives, having Pierre Poilievre or Danielle Smith just stand up in front of a camera, or like even look like they're taking a selfie and just delivering their message to the public, people seem to be much more receptive to that than the highly produced, high production value videos you saw, less than a decade ago.
Yeah.
And the conservatives are doing that well.
But do you think that is because of social media and the need to have that like human component, or do you think like it's just how we've evolved across all channels?
I think it's a little bit of everything. I think people want, like, there's so much information available right now that people want to be able to feel like they've not just taken something at face value, that they understand what has led to it, or their ability to do some more research on it or to dive into it. And that feeling of not being like coerced into feeling a specific way, I think the general public across all party lines is looking to make up their minds on their own.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting is probably about a decade ago, and even as conservatives, we still talk about it. It's like you don't win with facts and figures and policies. Like at the
Hmm.
door, people don't, that doesn't resonate. And where we used to envy the left was that the left told stories. They like did
Hmm.
the, hook into your emotions and be relatable. So, like, what is this shift? Like, why have the progressives gone from something what I think was like envious and worked and humanizing all of these ideas as opposed to making them like bill one is going to be this? Why do you think you guys retreated from that? Like we're copying what you did 10 years ago, and I like to think doing it better and elevated it, but like why did you shy away from that?
I don't think the left has shied away from it. I think if you look, you still see a ton of stories everywhere. You see it in every NDP campaign. You see it in the Liberal campaigns. It's just that in the way that we're telling the stories, it's just not connecting with people the way that the Conservatives are. So if you watch, like, you can tell a story and you talk about policy at a high level, you've lost the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Or you tell a story and it's just not a story that people haven't heard before. Whereas on the other side, not only are the Conservatives talking in the way that regular people talk, but they're also taking advantage of the underlying emotions that came with COVID, the underlying
Mm-hmm.
organization that came with COVID, and they're tapping into those stories. And they have tens of thousands of people that see themselves in those stories, like one specific story.
Right. But it's interesting because, like, I would say, it's really hard for opposition to get their moment or get their soundbite or have the same profile. You see Pierre doing it to Justin Trudeau, but I don't see it happening with the Alberta NDP. I mean, you guys also put up different people. I know you're doing your critics and things like that, but there's not one consistent voice either. And I think that that's sometimes a challenge. But the other thing is, like, and I'm going to be critical right now, is like what I remembered from the campaign, and I know what actually hurt Rachel was like the tone. So it's one thing to tell a story when you're either the underdog or your opposition. I feel sometimes there's a balance between the fear mongering or the like angry,
Mhm.
frustrated tone versus the emotional, heartfelt, empathetic tone. So, like, is
Yeah.
that part of it, or did you take that away?
Yes, we
Yes.
intentionally said, let's be angry all the time.
But it did come across, and we heard it from like voters. We saw it in polling that like her action. So it's one thing, like you said, to tell a story, but I think how you tell it and how you're
Sure,
relatable
for sure.
is
And
definitely like a
And I
fine line.
think, like, if you look back at 2015, that campaign, like, there's a saying that the candidate who looks like they're having the most fun wins. And in
Hmm.
2015, that was true. Like, that was such a fun campaign, partly because we were the fourth party and we could throw anything out. There was nothing to lose. Like, you weren't trying to hold on to government.
Hmm.
And the stakes were relatively low and we had a great time. Fast forward to 2023, like, not only are the stakes much different, but also I think the what's at stake is much different. Like, it's hard to go in and have fun every day in a campaign when you truly believe, and I do think that this is where the NDP came from, that public health care is at risk, or that the future of the economy is at risk, or that people's jobs and livelihood are at risk. And it's hard to just like go out and make jokes and have fun every day when you believe that should your opponents be successful, that it will be detrimental to Alberta and to
Hmm.
Alberta's future. And so, yeah, some of the fun gets sucked out of that and it gets lost along the way. But this is where we're at in politics.
Yeah, because you're accountable and you have a record now that you have to defend, I think is also, it's easier to be opposition. It's easier to, I mean, like you said, you can throw grenades if you're the underdog. Heck, I've never been in an underdog party.
Shocking.
Briefly for the Wild Rose, but they were also like on the trajectory of becoming government before someone crossed the floor, and that they tried to merge without using Jason Kenney to merge them. But like that's the only time I've kind of been in that underdog. I think it'd be so much fun. I've also never worked in opposition, like at the legislature. I don't think you have either, but it's
Yes, I
like in
have.
the because you came on when Rachel before you guys formed government. Right. Sorry. But like I've never worked. It would be so much fun because you just get to like kind of fuck around, like throw grenades, see what spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks. But I don't get why it's not working for you guys right now. Like again, I also don't see Nenshi getting
But like saying
some of the
it's not
traction.
working for us, like this is the fault of every party that's ever been in power, is that you think you'll always be in power. And yeah, it's not working for us because you're government right now. The UCP is government, but it won't always be the government. Like eventually it's going to work. And, you know, there is a lot of new energy and there is a lot of fight and there is a lot of fun in the NDP right now. And there's a lot of new members that are getting involved. And eventually that's going to culminate in the government changing. Like I can't predict if it will be the next election. I hope it is, or the election after that. But like the UCP is not going to be government forever. And I wanted to go back to something that you said, that you've never been in the opposition, because I think this is kind of telling about the
like
difference in the
worked
parties.
for them, though. In fairness, like we have been in opposition. I just wasn't at the launch.
I remember.
Yes, that brief.
But this is, I
block
think,
it out.
like, I mean, I'm sure you'll disagree with me, but the difference between the NDP, at least the NDP sections that I've been involved in, is people get involved in the NDP because truly they want to make a difference. And NDP leaders like Rachel Notley, for example, Rachel Notley didn't want to be premier. She got into it because she believed that Alberta needed change and she wanted to be a part of that change and felt like she was a good vehicle for that change, not because she wanted to be in this position of power. Where I feel that on the other side, in conservative circles, people get into politics because they want to, especially in Alberta, align with the governing party. They want power. They want the top job. They want to win. And that's just, I mean, in terms of how each party looks at what they're trying to accomplish and what motivates members to get involved, I think they're really different.
But wouldn't you say like that's why Naheed Nenshi had such a big thing? Like he was kind of not my pick, but like he was kind of ahead of the game the whole time, right? Like he was always the favorite. I could say that was the same when Jim Prentice came in, right? Like it was a change and a new person, but like you had the highest membership you've ever had under Nenshi. And it was kind of like, I feel, and again, I'm not in the party, but folks that I know that have NDP memberships were like, well, he's going to win, so I'm voting for him. So does that mean like you think your membership's changed from like
No.
the growth changes?
I mean, you can still want to win and be motivated by change. Like what I'm saying
right,
is,
but this man didn't even come out with like an NDP platform or what he was running on. Like he was the only candidate that didn't really have like why I'm running and
Erica,
what I'm
this is a weird pivot. I'm saying as a whole, the NDP
I know, I'm using
is
the most recent
motivated.
example.
But I'm saying the NDP as a whole, and like leadership included, the NDP as a whole, the membership is motivated by affecting change. Whereas I've always felt that conservatives join to be in power.
I would probably agree with you until what we saw with like the PCs. I think that they just stayed in power. They very much moved to the center. Like, so I think they maybe got away from some of their values and like were too progressive than conservative. And so I do think that that was to hold power. I do think that they weren't truly a conservative government by the end of it. But I think that all kind of switched when we saw the UCP form. And that was about change. That was about getting that current government out so that we could have a spot, which I think is always the opposition
goal. That's the same motivation. If your number one goal is get them out and get us in, that is being motivated by power.
So Rachel was just running for Premier of Alberta or as leader to like for shits and giggles, like
no, to reform environmental policy, to reform tax policy, to make Alberta's system more democratic. Like she wasn't running because she wanted to be premier and wanted to be in power. She was running because she wanted to affect change that had long been ignored in Alberta for decades.
Yeah, and I hear that. That sounds very whimsical. I would say that Jason Kenney
true.
literally ran, and our whole party was developed on getting rid of a carbon tax. So like that's, yes, to have power to be able to make those changes, but that was literally on reforming what they believed were bad policies and not in the best interest of
But he couldn't
people.
reform it because it was a federal policy. So that's a weird thing.
Well, that was a later issue, but that was Bill 1, right? Whether you agree on how the policy went and all the Supreme Court stuff.
But I'm just saying it was a federal policy. We all knew it was a federal policy. It's still a federal policy. And if your whole party was formed on fighting a federal policy, you weren't actually formed on affecting change.
Well, I agree in hindsight what you're saying, but I still think, and like if you're trying to say that, I mean, if you were saying that NDP traditionally as an ideology looks at the community versus an individual, and that there's power associated with individual control, like sure, from an ideological standpoint, but like I can't see a world where you're like, these people only run to like be a minister. And that's happened a few times. I would say people get involved and they're like, I want to be a minister, but I don't think that doesn't happen on the other side where they're like, I just want to hold hands and kumbaya and make the world a better place.
That's all the NDP does.
I thought so, but I like have never
You
been
should
there,
see
so
those
so
cabinet
glad.
meetings.
Yeah, they're like, we don't need tables. We're just going to sit in a circle.
Cross-legged.
Yeah.
This is the other interesting thing, though, that you brought up is, like, I agree that the Conservatives, and I like lots of credit to the Conservatives, their campaigning is incredibly effective right now. The problem is if you campaign on, like, we're going to get rid of the carbon tax, just like Pierre Poilievre is doing right now, those slogans like axe the tax or forming a party promising to get rid of a federal policy, those are really catchy. And for sure, you know, they evoke emotion in people. They latch onto what people are frustrated with. That is totally what politics should be. The problem is that when you get into government, they're pretty tough to deliver on. Like Jason Kenney could not have delivered on that. He didn't deliver on it. If Pierre Poilievre continues to run on just axe the tax with nothing to backstop it and nothing to replace it with, that also is pretty hard to go 4 years on without an answer to the question, and what would you do? And so, those campaigns are hard to implement if they're built purely on talking points.
Yeah. But slogans, I mean, date back forever on all parties to get attention, right? And so, yeah, the challenge is always proof in the pudding of how are you going to implement this? You know, nothing's coming to mind right now because you guys were in power for such a short period of time and so long ago.
Brought in generational reform.
Okay. But like
we
what I'm
did.
saying is that like you ran on something. You ran on change in 2015, which is fair.
But Erica, like specifically, we ran on environmental reform, whether you believe with what the committee came up with in terms of carbon pricing or not, it was still very reforming. We brought in an emissions cap. We phased out coal. Like them or not, those are really reforming policies, plus got big money out of politics, banned out of province donations. So, the Conservatives never rolled those back because Alberta needed them. Like the NDP came in with big promises,
of the electricity grid stuff,
and all of it stuck. And all of it stuck because no one's going to change it.
Let's look at coal. You guys had a very aggressive campaign to get rid of coal. I would argue maybe too aggressive. Do I agree with the
companies phased out faster than the deadline? So probably not too aggressive.
But we still are having challenges. Like now we're depending on wind and solar to the same degree. I just think it was too aggressive. But to come
it was
back to your
also
point,
a federal policy.
Not at the time.
Yes, it was a federal policy before.
But not on the timeline you guys had.
No, but the companies phased out even before our timeline.
Okay, but like I still think though that like when we're looking at coal, when we're looking at like doing it properly, I never agreed with the federal system, and now we're seeing what's happening. We don't have hydro like other provinces, so like I still think that Alberta was at a loss of the federal policies because we've also seen them do electricity.
But we've also had an energy expert, an electricity expert on our podcast to say this isn't true.
He said it wasn't great. He said neither the UCP or the NDP did it properly. No one really wins the electricity file, and I think it's important that like I don't think you could have solved healthcare. What did you do in healthcare? Nothing.
Could we have solved healthcare? No, I don't think
that was exactly the time that you would have. But I think, well, I will note that when we get to the polls,
we funded healthcare to a degree.
So did we. We overfunded. No, we funded more per capita than anyone else, and I don't think it was efficient.
We're getting a little Trumpian, but the PCs before us, so I'm not talking about the UCP, I'm talking about what the NDP came into, had dramatically cut healthcare and not increased any funding year over year, even with inflation. That is a cut. The NDP funded healthcare, like actually funded healthcare, which is a starting point for healthcare reform, the absolute basics of starting point.
So you put more money at it. We didn't have a reduction of the wait times. They were getting worse already before even COVID. That's exactly when you should be funding more doctors if you look at the timeline of how you train a doctor for 8 years. So I could say you guys are the problem for why we don't have doctors because there wasn't investment into
for the 4 years that the NDP was in power versus the Conservatives 50 years. It's the NDP's fault.
The PCs were outed for the right reason.
No sense. The PCs are the UCP, Erica. Like
no, they aren't. Oh my gosh, half of the PCs, the progressive world, is like in your tent now.
Well, obviously half of them are, but a big chunk of them, like you don't have a coalition without part of that party.
Yeah, but I don't think it's as big as you think it is.
Well, it's the right part of the party stayed. The conservative side of the party stayed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I like it. There's no P, progressive. Don't like that. That's for you guys to use.
Fair, we'll take them.
Okay, so we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but like maybe because you're so passionate about Rachel's quote unquote generational reforms and all those things, why don't you how did you get involved? Like it was very different for you versus me getting involved, and like what got you involved? Because we're both very passionate. I think we can say that. I think we can both agree that our parties are not always 100% right, and we'll get to where we think they're not. I have to talk about it more regularly than you do when we get into the legislation that my party sometimes introduces. But yeah, like I know you got involved after journalism, but like what excited you? Besides, again, was it about getting the government out? That was important?
Well, no,
For
because I joined
power?
the
You wanted
fourth
power?
party, the fourth party with 4 seats. So certainly didn't join thinking that, the next
You
election
knew you
we
were
were
only
going
going to
to
go up.
Do I get to answer this question?
No, I think I was funny.
Okay, so I joined with 4 seats. I left journalism. I had a really good friend who I'd gone to college with who was in politics, and I had been hanging out with him in Edmonton when I was a journalist. And because, before the NDP were in power, parties all hung out. Like, there wasn't, the New Democrats, the Liberals, everybody hung out together, and there wasn't like a, divide in terms of social situations. And so when I hung out with him, often there was some New Democrats there. And when I left journalism, I said to him, like, I really want to be involved in politics, but not your politics. Like, please help me make friends.
Yeah, I know who he is, and that would have been quite a leap.
And I just introduced me to some New Democrats. And so I came into the NDP because truthfully, like my underlying values, although I really was unbiased, not involved in politics at all as a journalist, my underlying values aligned with the NDP. And so I came into the NDP doing comms and media relations for the fourth party in a very small caucus with 4 members, and then, had this massive historic election in 2015 and stayed on for the next 4 years. And then once you're in the NDP, truthfully, you can never leave. So although I've officially been out of the NDP since 2019 when we lost the election, obviously I've stayed in on campaigns and on the periphery ever since, and I probably always will.
Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting because like you always stay. Is it because you buy a federal membership and a provincial and you guys are like a cult or what? Like what?
No,
I get why you stay, but like how does that relationship work? I know like your party had to deal with the provincial and federal relationship. It came up during your leadership. Like what does that look like? I think it's like I haven't seen anything kind of come from that yet, but like what is that divide? We had it a long time with like PCs and the CPC just because they were very different, but
I mean, this conversation comes up in a number of jurisdictions. Like, should we be tied to the federal party, especially after some of the issues around disagreement around, energy development has come up? That was an issue when Rachel Notley was premier, and the federal party took a much different stance on energy production and the Trans Mountain Pipeline than she did. But truthfully, like it kind of pops up now and then as like a should we decide to officially separate? And like I've said this before, I think it's honestly a waste of time. Like, sure, you can go through the process of constitutionally separating, which is pretty complicated. And then you're still called the NDP. And when you if you're worried about knocking on someone's door and then being like, well, but are you part of the federal NDP? If you say, well, actually, now we've gone through a process to constitutionally separate, I don't think that means anything to voters. So it kind of depends. Are you talking about a massive rebrand for provincial sections where you now believe your underlying values are different, your name is different, you are focused on different things? That's a completely different conversation than should we constitutionally separate from the federal party.
What is the implications? Like, is it just like in good faith you agree? So say that situation, right? There's very different energy policies under Jagmeet Singh than now under Nenshi or Notley. Like, what does that look like? You guys just like don't sit in the same circle when you all get together?
There's no, I mean, I think at least I've worked really closely with Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. And in every situation, it's been like those leaders stand up for their province first. And the federal party knows that. And so if the federal party feels they need to take a specific stance on something and, for example, Rachel Notley doesn't agree with it, they expect, and it happens, that federal NDP or provincial NDP leader stands up and says, I don't agree with those guys. They're wrong. And we're going to do something different. And that's the way the disagreement goes.
And like I know how it plays out for us that it hurt us federally when people were mad at Jason Kenney and the UCP in 2021. So can you separate? Like would it, like you said, it's not worth it.
But it's a much different dynamic, I think, for you guys because Alberta has historically voted conservative federally. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
worry about the implications for your federal party. Like what Jason Kenney did would have implications on his party's success in the next federal election in Alberta. That's not so much of an issue. Like, yes, it's some issue because the NDP holds an Edmonton seat, a couple of Edmonton seats, and obviously wants to hold on to those. But it's not like, it's not like the NDP is picking up the majority of seats in Alberta and those are now at risk.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, we're not constitutionally bound. Like we had like some very interesting relationships when we had the Wild Rose and the PCs. And it was like some MPs would come to PC stuff, some would go to Wild Rose, some would go to both. It was kind of like a weird like divorce where people are like, do I go to this Christmas party or not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I
But
think
no,
that's
yeah.
normal. Like, I think
Do
I
you
don't
think though, like when it was Nenchi's position, I think he said like he'd review it and ask the
leave
membership,
it to the
right? Where
membership.
other
Yeah.
people, okay, so like what is that something that would come up at the convention? And what do you think if he didn't do it, would the members say?
I don't know. Like, I
Hmm.
haven't really, it was an interesting attention grabbing piece of the leadership. Will it come to the next convention? He's previously said that it would. So he probably has to do it, but I don't know what the members would say. I think there's a lot of people who support the federal party. I think there's a lot of people who didn't realize they held a federal membership. I think a lot of people are like me and think, why would we spend our time talking about something that I think is not that consequential when so many other things are so much more consequential? So like
You're
I
like
want to
foreshadowing my ick.
yeah, like I just want to talk about how we win the election. I want to talk about the
Mhm.
things that people care about. Like, what are we going to say about health? What are we going to say about affordability? What are we going to say about Alberta's economy? Like, that's what I want to spend our convention
Mhm.
talking about, not talking about the federal party.
Yeah, I mean, I just left a convention where I was like, I don't care about half this shit. Like, this is all weird policy that hasn't, like, doesn't it really speak to one, how you win the next election, and two, what are like at the forefront. So I get it. I think it'd be interesting. You guys haven't had a convention in a little, like a hot minute because of leadership, right? Like yours aren't annually because you're not like under the Societies Act with
No,
AGMs, right? So you
no.
can have conventions whenever. Um, so I mean, I think that'll be interesting. Okay, you said your values, so I want to dig a little bit deeper
Wait.
into
Why
that.
is it
Like,
just you asking me? Let's go back to
well,
you
because
and
you
how
don't care
you.
about me. You told me to shut up, and then you call me a Trumpite,
No.
and then now you just don't care about me.
Wow, so sensitive today. Okay, I told you, I didn't tell you to shut up. I asked if I could possibly answer the question you asked me without you interrupting me, which we know is not possible. And I didn't call you a Trumpite. I just said, you're leaning into Trumpian language. So let's go back to you and how you got into let's not just say the UCP, but like conservatives of Alberta.
I'm just pausing so I know I don't interrupt you again.
Uh-huh.
So I feel like I'm the exact opposite. I was like a party kid, came into it, moved here from Saskatchewan. My family was involved in Saskatchewan and Alberta. My aunt got me involved. I was trying to take sciences in first semester and then realized I had no idea why I had to balance a chemistry equation. Like I was like, I'm not doing this in real life. So then I decided what I'm good at is arguing and finding my point of view. So I switched into what I call the fake science, political science. And then I just got involved with like campus clubs, got involved with Calgary Varsity, which was we were an orphan riding. I can't remember. Lori Dobbs, I want to say, was the liberal MLA for a long time. Yeah, just grew up, was part of PCYA, even though I don't support youth wings. And then got involved in Gary Marr's campaign and moved up to Edmonton under Alison Redford and that whole story and all that stuff that happened. Helped write a resignation speech. Then tried to leave, like you. And then I went Wild Rose and wasn't really involved heavily. I mean, their presence, I don't even think our board meetings usually had quorum because of like how small the base of the Wild Rose was in, Edmonton. But yeah, and then got back involved with the UCP because I feel like I was one of those people that like the Wild Rose and the PCs in the middle was where my membership would lie, like as my values and beliefs. So I believe in like super small government, get the hell out of my house, don't tell me how to live, individual freedoms, low taxes. I don't want to think about government unless I have to, and that the systems just all work in the background. And that's kind of why I liked it. I think it was very different looking back now of what my values are and how the PCs operated versus the UCP. And yeah, so it's been quite a journey of the merger of having one leader and then another. I've federally and provincially been involved and had so many leaders. I can't even remember how many we've had or how many premiers I've gone through. But Rachel was always there, just hanging out, her and Brian. But yeah, but I think that's the thing with the values that I want to kind of dig on you. Like and when we get into the Icks, like I'm super like textbook conservative, traditional values of all, like again, small government.
How's that going, by the way?
Well, we're not at the ick yet, so we'll get there when we get there. But how's like, what are your values? You said like you found about values and beliefs, and I totally believe that. And I think that everyone that gets involved with a party, you have to have that. Like it's passion that you can't unteach of why you support your party, and you're never going to agree with them 100%. But what were the values and beliefs that really stood out for you?
Okay, I'm going to tell you, but I don't want you to say, oh, that sounds so fluffy and nice and cliche, and you're just like on the moral high ground. So I'm going to tell you, and you're going to not make fun of me.
Promise.
I liked the NDP because in jobs that I had in the past, like journalism or some of the work that I'd done overseas, really like bringing a voice to the voiceless, standing up for the little guy, like making sure that everybody's got a fair shake no matter what your access to a platform or access to power is. That's what I liked in the NDP, like making sure, and I know this is cliche, but like every person that goes and works a full-time job should be able to feed their family. And I felt like when I got to the NDP, they were fighting for the little guy. And I felt like I could be a part of that fight and I could add something to that fight and I could fight for something better for Alberta, for my future kids' future. And I just really felt like I found a home there. So I know that sounds super cliche and I know that sounds super
I think
fluffy.
mine probably sounds cliche where I'm like small government, blah, blah, blah. Like it's because, at the end of the day, like you want to fight. And again, coming back to like what the left and the right is like you're more community. You're more like go to the weakest link and carry them along, where I love that I'm part of a community and a party that like I can be the best I can be and I have the opportunities. It's about me taking and running with them. And I think that those are just like fundamental differences between our two parties or the two ends of the spectrum that it's not corny. I don't know why you would think I would say something like that. I think it was beautiful on why you're involved with the NDP. Just like it's, yeah.
Great. Let's go to,
now let's go to the Icks.
Your ick.
Okay. So I'm sure you could probably pick up on it, or at least you do when we chat. My biggest ick is like the lack of consistency of being conservative. So I just told you why I believe in it. I've said a few times on this podcast, I don't love like the nanny stating in any way, shape, or form. And I've highlighted some of those times that I get frustrated with my party because of that. So again, I get that you're governing for all Alberta. I get that you're doing that, but I am like so fundamentally a conservative, not really outside of that ideology. And sometimes it frustrates me when we're not conservative first.
So like what's happening right now that's not conservative first?
Oh, okay. So just like get on my little notebook. I think that, like I said, some of the stuff with nanny stating like even on the parental rights, because again, I look at this and I support all the policies across the board for different reasons. But if we're looking at it from fundamentally a parental rights perspective, which I believe is, a conservative traditional value, then when we don't allow parents to make that decision for their children, I think there's other changes to the policy. And so I do agree with the policy, but for different reasons. But on the parental rights, if that's the argument, that isn't a parental right because you're not giving the decision to the parents. So that's one where I'm like, everything else makes sense and it's all the same narrative. And then it's like, oh, what is that? Right. Some of the, involvement in coming right in and blowing something up sometimes. Like I do agree with the reform, but again, when government is making those decisions, that's where I'm like, that's big government. Our cabinet is quite huge. So to me, I'm like small cabinet, small government. Again, I do love the fight with Ottawa. I think that that's one that has consistently been probably the only thing that's been consistent through the UCP is that. But then again, you've pointed out sometimes where the jurisdictional issues are kind of like Is that hypocritical? Like, is that nanny stating? Or are you getting too involved in someone else's house? So I gave you a few there, but again, it's
So
usually like
weird.
one, I know, but it's like one piece of a policy and I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Ooh. And
Well,
that's like my struggle.
I also disagree with all the things you don't like. So we have a lot in common there.
It's probably because I just want to hang out with you and sit in across from each other holding hands with our legs crossed.
We're
Or something. So I'm
closer
trying to
and
get
closer every day.
Okay, so I can think off the top of my head like probably a dozen things that are your icks, or that they would be my icks. So why don't you share with us now? And this one can't
Wow.
be fluffy.
Okay, this one, it's not fluffy. It's just the NDP for a long time has sort of like, there's been like a purity test to really feel like you're part of the party. And some of this is evolving a little bit, especially with Naheed becoming leader, but it exists in every jurisdiction where it feels like you need to have accomplished a certain amount or be committed at to a certain level to be able to be truly accepted into the party. And I think for a long time that held people back from joining, and it also alienated people who were already involved. Like I came from journalism. I didn't have a background. My parents weren't deeply involved in the NDP or any political party. And so for me, I feel like I'll never reach a purity test if there is one for the NDP, because I don't have, like, my childhood was not spent in New Democrat diapers. And there is sort of this like precedent across the country that you're not really a New Democrat until you've done X number of campaigns, or you've taken a position on X number of social issues, or you've worked in the trenches. And we will never be successful as a party unless we can open those doors and say everybody has a place here. And like I said, I think that is starting to happen, but it has certainly been an ick or a pet peeve of mine for years and years about us.
Okay, so on this purity test, I mean, we have like red Tory, blue Tory, and those are differences within. But like, what do you mean, like this actual purity test? And is it like a level across? You've worked in a few different provinces for the NDP now. Um, what does that look like? And does it differ in Alberta? And is there a higher standard, do you think?
It's not like it's unspoken. Like I can't tell you
No,
exactly
I know,
what
but
it
I'm saying, like,
is.
do you feel it's different? I mean, coming into a new province and running a campaign, I'm sure that there's difference. Like, you're not a Saskatchewan
No,
NDP.
I think it's the same everywhere. Like everybody has sort of a different, like obviously there's a long, long history of the NDP being in power in Saskatchewan. And so perhaps, the purity test is higher. I don't know, but there certainly is an expectation of like, you've done your time before you were really considered, influential or like active or have proven yourself in the party. And I mean, for new people looking for a political home, I think that just turns so many people away.
Do you think that that's because of like the union mentality, or that it was like you come from like your way in traditionally was through that portal?
I'm not exactly sure where it comes from, but I do think that a ton of people in the NDP have spent their lives working for a specific cause, and that is like making life better for people under the NDP values. And, a lot of time, for in Alberta, for example, like really, really like putting in time in the trenches with no path to forming government. And then a lot of people came in when we formed government. And it's like, I've been here for decades and decades and decades toiling away. And now, you just come in and eat the cake at the end. So I don't know if some of it is like the time that people have really dedicated as big portions of their life to getting the movement and the party to where it is, and they deserve the credit that they deserve for all of that time and effort. But it doesn't mean that we can't invite new people in all the time.
Yeah. No, and I get that. I think like to me it kind of sounds like elitism of like you're a better NDP than I am, but again, I'm not there and I don't know how you feel. Question for you though, because I gave an ick of my current government and current party. What is something, or like, and you can't use Bill 6, but like what's a thing that you were just like ick, like in the past, either or something that Nenshi's doing, or something you've seen in the party since you left, or even under your time with Rachel? I'm gonna make you give me like a actual example.
Well, I mean, I can give you an ick of our own government in that we, like, this kind of goes back to like what I think the Conservatives do much better than us, is that we spent so much time, and this is like, mostly aimed at myself because I ran communications in the NDP government, is like, we just talked about policy that people didn't understand a bajillion times. So like when we knew we need people to believe that the NDP has a path forward for Alberta, and then we talked about the petrochemical investment program and polyethylene crackers every day for like months and months and
Someone
months.
needs an acronym for that.
Yeah, thinking like that, PIP, But still, when you say PIP, no one knows what it means.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying
And
it needs to be caught on.
We talked about it every day, believing that if we talked about it every day, that when people went to the ballot box, they would be like, well, these guys brought in a polyethylene cracker and that really helped the heartland. And so they must be the ones that we trust with the economy. And I hate that about ourselves, that we believe that that's how people talk. Like, and we still believe that. Like, it's still it's a slow transition to go from realizing that you talk like that to actually changing the way you talk.
Which is why I think, again, like Axe the Tax works, right? It's catchy. People know what it means, but do they know the ins and the outs of the policy? No. Like you could put like, it's the heart of Heartland. Well, this is what I mean. Like it's removing something or just scratching it all together on any type of carbon pricing. And so, but is that really what it looks like? I don't know. We saw Aaron O'Toole struggle with that. But again, I think that people want to believe in something. And I don't think a lot of times they need to know all the nitty gritties of everything. And so like for me, even coming back to my ick, it's like, just balance the budget and give me my tax cut. Like, and it's not, I'm not even getting it, but like, it's like, do the things that I believe are fundamental. I don't care about all the other stuff. You got to make some tough decisions. You got to make some cuts on certain places. I support that because it's like fundamental about balancing the budget. So it's just, I just think it's interesting on looking at like over talking or considering I'm the one that over talks and over communicates in this pod. But that you that was a good one. That like you felt that you guys talk about policy so much. And again, I think it's like a 180 from where we were 10 years ago, where you guys could pull on heartstrings and tell those one-off stories and you don't even have to point to policy. And like, I don't really, I think Jagmeet Singh still does that. Like, cause I mean, he's not really in a position where he's going to form government.
I think part of the problem with like the NDP in opposition, especially from 2019 to 23, is that we held this burden of having been in government. Like when you have access to all this information, and now you're not just telling stories, you're not just talking about what it could be. You have all this information, and it's hard to forget it all, and it's hard to not offer the details when you know exactly what the government is doing because you've been there and you've seen inside the books and you've seen inside the closed doors. And yeah, that's helpful in terms of offering real solutions. But when it comes to telling like really simple stories to the electorate, now it's complicated.
Well, now we know your ick is purity tests and you're over communicating policy, and mine is I wish everyone was more conservative. But that's
Shocking.
Our show. Yeah,
that's our show. That's our episode on party politics. Remember, new episodes drop every Thursday morning. So like and subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.
And while you are liking and subscribing there, know we have upped our social media game. So you can find us on X, Instagram, and now TikTok. And if enough followers, Cheryl has agreed to do a duo dance with me on that. So let's get some subscribers there, folks. See you next week.
Unconfirmed.
The Discourse is hosted by Cheryl Oates and Erica Barudis. Follow on Instagram at The Discourse Pod. Subscribe to The Discourse on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.